Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's WineVine virtual tasting series. And tonight we're featuring Sauvignon Blanc. This is presented by the New York Wine and Grape Foundation, and we're very happy to have you all with us today. My name is Julie Purpura Hosbach, and I am the Education and Member Services Manager at the New York Wine and Grape Foundation. I am a certified sommelier through the Court of Master Sommeliers, a certified specialist of wine through the Society of Wine Educators, and WSET III certified, which basically means I'm a huge wine nerd and love discussing and appreciating wines, especially from New York State. So thanks for joining me tonight. This webinar will be an introduction to appreciating wines from 3 different regions, specifically Sauvignon Blanc, from 3 different regions around New York State. Before we officially kick off, I want to thank you for your involvement in the New York Wine and Grape Foundation and being a New York wine enthusiast. We plan on continuing to build educational programming online. So stay tuned for more webinars and virtual tastings and events. If you have any requests for specific topics, please email me or call me. I will put my information in the chat bar. And if you want to check out our New York drinksnewyork.com, so it's nydrinksny.com website, there are lots of postings about upcoming virtual tastings and events by wineries from around New York State. If you're new to Zoom, you can scroll over your screen and see that there is a chat bar and a Q&A feature. You can use either or if you have questions. Put them in the Q&A bar. I would love if you put all of your comments and thoughts in the chat toolbar. There is no such thing as a stupid question, and there are no wrong answers in how you smell and taste these wines, right? It's all for fun and for learning and great appreciation. So don't be shy. Feel free to use the chat bar. The more participative it is, the more fun it is. Hopefully you got the tasting sheet that I sent out to you. You're welcome to use that to take notes or not. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Again, this is edutainment, fun learning. There will be a link to the recording with the notes included that I'll send out to you all by Monday. And without further ado, let's get into tasting our wines tonight. So hopefully you were able to get them. Tonight we are tasting, as I said, Sauvignon Blancs from around New York State. So Sauvignon Blanc is one of the one of the 6 epic Vitis vinifera wines, alongside Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, Merlot, and Cabernet Sauvignon. And its Old World or European home is often associated with Sancerre in the Loire Valley. That's typically, if you like Sancerre, that's Sauvignon Blanc. And if you like Bordeaux white blends, they are typically Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon blended together. New World wine regions that have been somewhat notorious or are more notorious for Sauvignon Blanc, definitely New Zealand, Chile, and California does a lot of Sauvignon Blanc production. Have any of you heard of Fumé Blanc before? Does anybody know what Fumé Blanc is? Have you heard from that? It's in California. It's typically out of California. Fumé Blanc, again, feel free to chat anything or type anything in the chat bar. Fumé Blanc is Sauvignon Blanc that has oak in it. It's Robert Mondavi came up with that, and typically wineries tend to follow that. Typically, in general, a lot of Sauvignon Blancs aren't oaked. They're typically youthful, young, fresh, very refreshing, acidic, and great for summertime. I mean, they're great anytime, but probably they tend to get more consumption in the spring and summer. So as we're gearing and getting ready for summer, and most of us probably have spring fever, especially in these recent times, it's a great wine to have and good for a food pairing too. So the first wine we're tasting is Hosmer Winery's 2018 Sauvignon Blanc. Hopefully you were able to get your hands on it. This winery is located on the west side of Cayuga Lake, and Cameron and Maren Hosmer are the owners. They first planted in 1972, and they opened their tasting room in 1985. So longstanding family operation. Julia Hoyle is their winemaker, doing some amazing, great wines there. I highly recommend, if you haven't visited and or checked out more of her wines, that you give them a try. All right, so if you're new and joining me for the first time, I'm going to walk you through the steps of wine appreciation. Again, don't be shy, join right in. There are no wrong answers. So first thing we do is look at wine. The best way to see wine is under good light and at a 45-degree angle, and preferably against a white backdrop. So if you have that tasting sheet or something white in front of you, that would be the ideal setting to look at it. When you're looking at a wine, it can be clues to the actual grape varietal used, as well as how old the wine is. So white wines tend to get more golden and darker as they age. Red wines tend to get lighter and more brickish brown color. As I said, Sauvignon Blancs generally are pretty youthful. You don't see a lot of old vintage Sauvignon Blancs. So these ones tonight are all, the first one is 18 and the other two are 17. So there shouldn't be a drastic difference there. Obviously you can see if there's bubbles or anything else in the wine, but mainly we look for the color of the wine and its clarity. So is it clear? Can you completely see through it? Or is there like a cloudy haze to it? Old world producers, again, European, tend to maybe not do as many clarification steps, though most producers around the world today are pretty much doing all of the clarification steps, so that probably 95% of your wines are crystal clear in clarity. And if you find one that's cloudy, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. They just didn't put it through as many clarification steps. So it's perfectly okay to drink. It's just a winemaker's style and preference. All right, so back to the color of this wine. I would say it's pretty pale straw, right? It's almost clear, almost the color of water. And it's clear, not cloudy. All right, next step is to swirl your wine and smell it. Smelling your wine is really probably the most important step of wine appreciation, definitely tied with tasting, because 85 to 90% of what we taste really comes from our sense of smell, because our olfactory system is much stronger than our sense of taste. We only taste really sour, salt, bitter, and sweet. So really stick your nose in. Sauvignon Blancs are pretty characteristically aromatic, right? They usually have pretty intense aromas and lots of aromas. What are you smelling in this wine? Again, feel free to type your comments in the chat bar so that everybody can see there's no wrong answers. So typical Sauvignon Blanc is very fruity, depending on where in the world, what region you're in. Sometimes it's more tropical, sometimes more citrus. I do get a lot of citrus in this one. Gooseberries are another really common descriptor of Sauvignon Blanc. If you're familiar with gooseberries, if you haven't had them before, then that might be something you want to try so that you know what they smell like. Also, Sauvignon Blanc is known for being really herbaceous. So you might be picking up basil or sage or oregano. Like there's definitely an herbal component to Sauvignon Blancs generally, or I'm getting that in this wine. And whether you smell grapefruit and your friend smells lemon, right? Like as long as you're in the same family, like again, everybody's olfactory senses are a little bit different. Anything else anybody's smelling? Okay, go ahead and taste it. So when you taste it, try to swirl it around your entire mouth. Feel free to go and take another sip. When we're tasting and appreciating wines, obviously the most important question is how do you like it and if you like it. But there are structural elements pretty much in every wine. So there's some level of acidity, and acidity is like biting into a lemon. So your jaw tenses, your mouth waters. If you tuck your chin in, you would have the propensity to drool. That's acidity. Acidity is typically higher in cool climates as compared to warm and or hot climates. It also is pretty common in Rieslings, sparkling wines, and Sauvignon Blancs. They're typically wines that are known for pretty high acidity. So this is a pretty high acid wine. You should have felt your mouth watering, jaw tensing. Then we talk about sweetness, or the absence of sweetness, which is a dry wine. So according to the International Riesling Foundation scale, which you might sometimes see on the back of bottles, which this one actually has, so if you have the Hosmer bottle, it has it on it. Though it was created by the International Riesling Foundation, it was pretty widely adopted by most producers as a tool for consumers to know which level of sweetness there is. Typically, if there's less than 1% residual sugar, it's labeled as dry. 1 to 2% is off dry, 2 to 4% is medium sweet, and anything above 4% is labeled sweet. And that can range anywhere from just into that sweet category of like 5% all the way into late harvest and ice wines that are typically like 15+%. So there's quite a diversity in sweet wines. Just know when you're purchasing. Anyway, this wine, do you think it was dry, in the middle, or sweet? Do you actually taste any sugar? One thing to be aware of when you're tasting wines is that things that smell fruity tend to make us think they're sweet, though they might not necessarily have sugar in them. So if you think you might be tricked by fruit or the smell of fruit, something that they teach you in these tasting classes is that if you plug your nose and take a sip of the wine at the same time, I encourage you to do it. You're not on camera like I am. If you keep your nose plugged the entire time while you swallow, you'll be able to discern whether you actually taste sugar or it was the smell that was making you think it was sweeter. And if you didn't already look at the scale, you don't taste sugar when your nose is plugged, or at least very little. There might be like 0.5%. So this would be labeled a dry wine. All right, so we talked about acid, we talked about its sweetness level. In red wines, we typically talk about tannins. So tannins are that like textural component, mouth drying feeling. It makes you want a glass of water. It adds like a smoothie, creamy texture to a wine. Kind of makes you feel like you have chalk coated on your teeth and tongues. Your natural reaction is to go, all right, those are tannins. Typically, we only talk about them in red, a little bit in pink wines, or white wines that have oak, because you can, so tannins come from the seeds, skins, oh my God, seeds, skins, and stems of grapes. But also from oak contact. So any wine that is fermented on the skins, which typically are red wines, maybe some degree into your pink wines because they might have a little skin fermentation. You could possibly have a white wine that had skin contact and or oak contact and might have a low level of tannins, but I don't get any of that in this wine. So we're gonna not talk about the imperceptible tannins in this wine. And then the last thing is the body. Which is generally composed of the alcohol content and or the sugar content. So the higher of both of those things tends to make for a higher body. The best way to think about evaluating body, if you're new to this, is to try to think about it like milk. So skim milk is kind of like a light-bodied wine if it feels like that kind of weight on your mouth. And if it feels like cream, it's probably a full-bodied wine. So noting that, what level of milk would you place a Sauvignon Blanc at? I would probably place it at like 1%. It's a pretty light, medium minus bodied wine. And then on the note of alcohol, so alcohol can give you, the more you drink wines and practice wine appreciation, you'll get a sense of the alcohol content by a warming sensation. So typically most wines by Alcohol, Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB, by federal government, anything labeled a table wine previously was always 7 to 14% alcohol. Recently, they have extended that to 16%, especially for West Coast wineries, because a lot of their wines are in the 15%. So right now, it's 7 to 16%. Most wines fall between 11 and 14% alcohol, but that is the range. So if you feel no warming sensation when you drink wine, or maybe you feel a little bit in your nose, it's typically under 10%. Again, there's not many of those, maybe some Rieslings. And then if you feel a warming sensation in your throat, it's typically like 10 to 12-ish percent, 12.5. And then if you feel it in your chest, it's usually above 12.5-ish. There is a 1.5% wiggle room that the TTB gives because of vintage variation and the fact that the wines change so frequently. from year to year. Does anybody want to guess what the alcohol percentage is before looking on this wine? I would guess probably like 12.5%. Pretty much a third wine for me. Usually it is on the bottle somewhere. And on this one, if you have the Hosmer bottle, you'll see on the back, it is 12.7% alcohol. All right, so feel free to take a minute, write any notes. Anybody have any comments on this Hosmer Sauvignon Blanc? Any thoughts before we move on? All right, the second wine is Fjord Vineyards in the Hudson Valley. It is their 2017 Sauvignon Blanc. And Fjord Vineyards, as I said, is in the Hudson Valley in between two mountains, has a nice microclimate that allows them to grow different types of vinifera grapes, as well as hybrids. And that is owned, it was opened in 2013 by Matthew Spaccarelli, who is also the winemaker, and Casey Erdman. So they're producing some really awesome wines in the Hudson Valley and just opened a new tasting room. So hopefully when we can get out again, if you haven't been there, go check them out. Let's take a look at this 2017 Sauvignon Blanc. So again, teeny bit older, but still pretty light in color. I would still say pale straw. And it is clear. We smell this wine. So this one I definitely get some kiwi going on. Something that typically you get with a lot of Sauvignon Blancs, or what I used to say to my students is think green with Sauvignon Blanc. Again, you get often you get a lot of herbs. Sometimes you get like fresh cut grass or hay, kiwi, honeydew. I get both of those in this one. There's lots of green, lime zest going on. Anybody getting anything else? In white wines, we often talk about, in some white wines, you might get floral notes, you might get that sense of minerality, kind of like wet rock, wet moss. Those are common descriptors of white wines. Though I don't really get floral in this. If anything, I'd go like a herbal floral, like a lemongrass or something. Definitely get kind of more of that fresh grass smell, but still kind of the herbaceousness too. Another thing you get Sauvignon Blanc that's green is often green bell pepper. That can be associated with Sauvignon Blancs pretty typically. I don't know if anybody's picking that up. I kind of get a little bit of that. Anything else? All right, go ahead and taste it. Feel free to take another sip if you need to or want to. It's Friday night. So this wine, again, pretty medium high to high acid, right? My mouth's watering, jaw's tensing. It's very refreshing. Perfect summertime. In terms of dry, in the middle or sweet, is anybody getting any sugar in the middle? They don't have the scale on their wine, but it is dry. Definitely, again, if you're confused by the fruit, because we smelled a lot of fruit in the nose, plug your nose and take a sip. We're not going to talk about tannins. What about the body? Would you say like skim, 1, 2, whole cream? I would say again, probably a medium minus to light body, and or like 1% milk. And then if I were to guess that alcohol content, I would say it's similar to the last one, kind of a throat to chest wine, probably around 12.5% alcohol. And let's see if you have the bottle. I don't know if you can see it there, but this one is also 12.7. Very, very specific tonight. All right, any thoughts or comments on the Fjord Vineyard Sauvignon Blanc? I'll talk about wine and food pairings kind of with Sauvignon Blanc at the end. Unless anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to put them in right now. So we can see so far how, you know, each grape varietal, I guess we should back up and say, what makes any wine taste different from any other wine? There's usually three main categories, right? So a grape varietal in and of itself has banker characteristics. So Rieslings differ from Sauvignon Blancs, which differ from Chardonnays, which differ from Pinot Grigios, on, right? And then another big thing is where they're grown. The French have the term terroir, which is like a sense of place. There's no direct translation, but it's kind of like where it's grown, the climate, the soil, all the stuff that makes up the sense of where it's from. And then the third thing that makes a wine possibly taste different from any other wine are the production practices, right? What the winemaker does to it, whether it's an oak or stainless steel, whether it goes through all those clarification steps that we talked, you know, earlier. I was talking about clarification. There's like filtering, there's fining, there's racking, and they go in the opposite order. It starts with racking and then goes to fining and then goes to filtering. But there's lots of clarification steps that they can possibly undergo, whether they choose to add sugar or not, or leave residual sugar behind. So the actual way to leave sugar from the grapes plus yeast equals, in the basic alcoholic fermentation equation, alcohol plus carbon dioxide and heat. And so the more sugar we start off with doesn't make a sweeter wine, it makes a wine with higher alcohol. So again, warmer climates tend to have higher alcohol levels and lower acidity levels. Cooler climates tend to have higher acidity, lower alcohol levels, but a winemaker can do anything to change that depending on the laws of their country. But in the US, they can do whatever they want to change. So the production process plays a big role in the differences. So far, we can see some similarities between the two Sauvignon Blancs we've tasted, but also, you know, some subtle differences between the two from the different regions they were grown in and the different production processes that they might have undergone. All right, so the last Sauvignon Blanc we're tasting is Pellegrini Vineyards, which is on the north fork of Long Island, and it is their 2017 Sauvignon Blanc. And this winery, the vineyards were planted in 1982 by Joyce and Bob Pellegrini. They were the owners, and they opened a tasting room in 1991. They typically also grow a lot of vinifera varieties like Cab Franc, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay. Bob passed away in 2015, but Xander Hargrave is their winemaker, and Joyce still owns it. They are producing a wide range of estate wines, just like the other two wineries we've tasted. So far, these have all been estate vineyards where they grow the grapes that make their wines. Sauvignon Blanc might not be the #1 grape you associate with New York. Typically, it's Riesling, sparkling wine, Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc. Typically, Sauvignon Blanc usually a little bit more of a maritime or a slightly warmer climate, of which Long Island has, but specific sites, both Fjord and Hosmer have, because of where they're situated between mountains and bodies of water, help moderate their vineyards, and so they're able to grow Sauvignon Blanc grapes successfully. And you can find a decent amount of other Sauvignon Blancs. Again, not as popular as some of the other varieties, but it is growing in popularity. All right, so this one is also, I would say, pretty pale straw. Not a lot of variation in color from the rim. That can also be a sign of, so the rim variation can also be a sign of how old the wine is. And it is clear. What do you smell in this wine? I get a lot of citrus again. Seeing herbs coming in again. Even if you can't name the exact one, basil, sage, oregano, something in that family. A lot of dried green things in this wine. So yeah, more of those herbs. More of a hint of that minerality in this one, I think, than the other two we had. So whether that's like wet rocks to you, or what, if you can imagine yourself walking alongside a waterfall, right? Kind of that sort of smell, wet rock smell. Still maybe a teeny bit of honeydew in those green fruits. All right, go ahead and taste it. What do you think for the acidity? Mouth watering, jaw tensing? Still a good amount. I would probably say medium plus acidity in this one. In terms of dry in the middle or sweet, do we taste sugar? Any sugar? It's pretty dry again. Not talking, I don't pick up anything related to oak in aromas in any of these wines. So it leads me to believe they're not oaked, and then therefore I'm not picking up any tannins in the palate either, to confirm that these Sauvignon Blancs don't have any oak. And then body. This one probably has maybe a touch more than the other two. I would probably say medium minus to medium body in this wine. Alcohol content, I feel like it's a little bit warmer than the other two. Also, I wouldn't be surprised if this one was a little bit higher, just because, again, Long Island has a little bit more of a maritime climate, usually slightly warmer conditions, though in New York State, vintage variation is huge. So I said that earlier, if you're not familiar with vintage variation, it's that each vintage, each year's weather changes so much. So 2017 in the Finger Lakes, we had a really wet, cool summer, huge crop. 2018 was not as good. We had smaller crops, but a lot of people had a lot of extra from 2017, so it was okay. And then 2019 was a really nice vintage. We had a pretty warm summer and a beautiful fall. Nice dry sunny conditions in September for the most part, which was really good. So 2019 wines are probably just coming out on the market, some whites and rosés. But that should be a really good vintage. In 2016 in the Finger Lakes was really hot. I'm sorry, I'm not positive what Long Island and Hudson Valley's conditions were, but I think 2016 was pretty hot and dry everywhere. So that tends to make, for riper grapes, again, those higher sugar levels, which could lead towards higher alcohol. And it was really dry in 2016, which, if anything, grapes like slightly more drought conditions than really wet. They don't like their feet wet, or their roots to sit in water. They're more intense in flavor when they're slightly dry. Obviously, you don't want like a drought, because that will kill them, but slightly on the drier side is generally pretty good. If anything, typically in New York, we tend to have more precipitation than necessary. But back to this wine, sorry, I digress. What do you think where do you feel the warming sensation, nose, throat, or chest? For me, this is more of a chest wine, so I would be more inclined to say 13.5% alcohol. See if it's on. Sometimes a bottle will just say table wine. They don't actually have to say the exact percentage. And if you only find table wine, that means it's somewhere between that range that's accepted by acceptable by the TTB, which is somewhere between 7 and 16%. All right, so this one was right on the front and I missed it. It says 13%. So teeny bit more. Go ahead and make your notes on whether you liked it, any thoughts. Feel free to take a minute and put in any questions or comments you have in general about Sauvignon Blanc, New York wines. This is our final. We've been doing these since June and going through different varietals every month. So if you missed any or you want to check them out, they are on the New York Wine and Grape Foundation's YouTube channel. And as I said, that is my email. If you have any suggestions for topics, this is our New York Drinks New York website, which has lots of listings for upcoming events and virtual tastings. Unfortunately, right now, most wine, tasting rooms have to be shut down to tourists, but a lot of them are open for curbside pickup if you call and order ahead. And you can also order for most wineries' websites, you can order off. Most of them have online ordering and shipping. So definitely support New York wineries right now. Hopefully they'll be able to open soon and you can go visit them this summer. So wine and food pairings, I said I would get back to that. So Sauvignon Blanc is full, generally has good acidity. Acidity acts as a conductor of flavors in your food. So Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, sparkling wines, again, those high acid wines tend to be pretty good for wine and food pairing, or are good for a lot of wine and foods. I'm sure you've heard some of the stereotypes to match like white wines with your white food, your white meats like poultry and more seafood, and red wines with more red meat. Typically that's because you want to match the weight of the wine with the weight of the food. And typically whites are a little bit lighter in body and red's a little heavier, but there are exceptions both ways. In between, there's a lot of factors that go into the way of the body, as we said, alcohol and sugar content. So it's more important to match the weight of the wine and the weight of the food, the intensity of the wine, the intensity of the food. So these were really aromatic, pretty intense wines. Certain cooking methods make foods more intense or not intense. So if you fry or grill something, it's typically going to be more intense than if you steam or broil something, right? So smoky goes with oaky is one of my favorite guidelines for wine and food pairing. It has nothing to do really with Sauvignon Blanc, but if you're having a lot of grilled foods or smoked foods, typically you should try to get an oak wine. And there are, as I said, Sauvignon Blancs that are oaked, some from Sancerre or Pouilly-Fumé in the Loire Valley. Typically they're in more neutral or lighter oak. And then there is a thing in California. There's a market of Fumé Blancs that are oaked Sauvignon Blancs, so you can give those a try. Things that are really herbaceous are good with Sauvignon Blanc if you want to match complement flavors, because we picked up a lot of that. And citrus things are good. Foods that are generally hard to pair with wines, your best option would be Sauvignon Blanc because it has such high acidity and refreshingness, good palate cleanser in between foods. Somebody asked, what's your opinion of Australia and Sauvignon Blanc wines? Every country has producers that make good wines from different varietals. I think we'll see more diversity coming out of each country. There's definitely some really nice Sauvignon Blancs. Unfortunately, we don't tend to get the not so popular varieties here, is my experience. So I haven't had many Sauvignon Blancs from Australia, but some that I've had have been really good. So Sauvignon Blanc likes a lot of sunshine. That's why it does really well in New Zealand. So depending on what part of Australia it's being grown in, it can do really well there too. Any other questions on Sauvignon Blanc or Sauvignon New York or wine and food pairing? As I said, there's more virtual tastings going on all the time, weekly. You can check out NewYorkDrinksNewYork.com. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me if you didn't want to put them in the comment bar. So another question, is it true that California wine is better than New York wine? Totally, that is an opinion, not a fact. Depends on the producer and the varietal and every person. Like some people like apples and some people like bananas. Some people, I think it just depends on what your taste preferences are. Typically warmer climates, of which California generally is, though there are some cooler regions, you know, again, tend to have higher alcohols. There are certainly grapes that can be grown in California that can't be grown in New York, like Zinfandel. There's obviously a lot more Cabernet Sauvignon because they have a hotter, warmer climate, and different grape varietals need different growing degree days to fully ripen. But there are there are so many fantastic, delicious New York wines too, that California might not be growing, like Lemberger, Gruner Veltliner, like just because of our climates are different. And there's lots of high quality coming out of every region and state in the world. A lot of the high quality wines that are coming out of other regions, it's harder to get imported in or to access in our New York distribution. But again, there's natives, there are hybrids, there are vinifera, there's so many different regions in New York State. It makes lots, there are so many producers that are making lots of great wines. I highly encourage you to check them out. And just be open-minded. You know, you might not like a particular varietal at one winery, no matter where it's from, and you might like it, love it from another place. So don't think just because you have one Sauvignon Blanc you don't like from a certain place that you don't like Sauvignon Blancs. And you know, same thing with Cabernet Sauvignon. Just keep tasting. The only homework assignment I used to give my students in wine appreciation was to drink as many wines as you can, be open-minded. The best way to learn about wine and food pairing is to try as many wines as you can with dinner, you know, in moderation, but that's the best way to find out what you like, because there's really no rules with wine and food pairing. There's just a bunch of guidelines. So I said smoky and oaky, match flavor intensity, match body weights. You also want to have your wine be as sweet or sweeter than your food. So in old world countries, especially in European countries, they have wine all the time with their meals. They typically don't have a cuisine that is as sweet as the American cuisine. We tend to add sugar to a lot of things, whether it's in a marinade or a salsa or something that we cook with tends to sweeten our meals up. So that actually makes pairing dry wines, which tend to be more popular, though there's nothing wrong with liking sweet wines, and there is a huge market for that. But typically, you want your wine to be sweeter than the food, and so if you have a meal that has sweetness in it, then you typically might want to go with a more off-dry style of wine. Having something really sweet and then having a dry wine is kind of like brushing your teeth and having orange juice. Yeah, it's that bad. It makes your wine taste off and flabby. So if you're having dessert, either skip your dry wine or have a sweet wine with it. And just keep that in mind with all foods. So without any other further questions, again, if you have any, I'll stay on for a couple minutes if anybody has any, but thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Try to enjoy as much as you can, and thanks for joining me tonight. Another question, any good cheese to pair? So Sauvignon Blanc is classic pairing for goat cheese, right? Goat cheese tends to be a little bit more acidic and lighter. The creaminess of goat cheese kind of contrasts the acidity and bright, refreshing character of Sauvignon Blanc. So again, it cleanses your mouth and refreshes it. But yeah, Chèvre or goat cheese is a classic pair. Chèvre and Sancerre, goat cheese and Sauvignon Blanc, same thing. Tend to be a really good pairing. The common perception that wine and cheese are awesome together is a very blanket statement, right? So there are some amazing wines that pair with particular cheeses, right? There are certain wines that do not pair well with certain cheeses and will not be well. So depending on what cheese you have, right? Just like cheddar tastes very different than Pecorino, which tastes very different than Brie, which tastes very different from goat cheese. I would pair different varietals with each of those cheeses. But again, it's personal preference, and you can do whatever you want. But in general, there's generally particularly wines that pair better with certain cheeses and foods, or certain cheeses pair better with specific varietals than others. Any other questions or thoughts or comments? Again, you can always email me with any afterwards. Thank you again so much for joining me tonight, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.